Welcome, I'm Dr. Sherry Colby, and this is the second part of our lecture series on historical narratives. In our last lecture, we focused on the idea that narratives and narratives about history are everywhere. And we talked about the cultural influences that impact the way individuals perceive the past. And we also talked a little bit about the historical narrative inquiry model. Today we're going to focus on Paul Ricoeur and the foundational ideas that influence historical narratives. The foundational idea behind Paul Ricoeur's work is that history is a form of memory, and that memory or that history is about individuals, about collectives or groups of people, as well as public history. And all of this is important in understanding the philosophy of historical narratives. Paul Ricoeur reminds us that history ultimately is narrative in nature. No matter whether or not history is written argumentatively, narratively, or philosophically, there still is someone or a group of people doing something, acting in a space and place in time with particular outcomes. So the form of history is narrative in nature. When we understand that, we understand why it is that history can be so abused and also used in such a potent, powerful way. So any narrative, whether fictional or historical, has the potential to influence our acts of consciousness. And in the case of historical narratives, the wise or unwise use or the wise or unwise construction of historical narratives can have all kinds of interesting influences. They may influence the way we remember and the way we forget the past. Some events in history are remembered better than others. Others have been completely forgotten. We may commemorate and degrade other acts or events in history. History can be fabricated, as in the case of cultural media examples and popular culture. Historical narratives may persuade, they may acculturate, socio-politicize, symbolize, moralize, entertain, even construct our very identities, and ultimately lead to the acquiring of language, which is an argument that Jerome Bruner makes. Ricoeur reminds us that history is ultimately about human beings, and that historical narratives humanize time. So here's this wonderful quote from Time and Narrative. Time becomes human to the extent that it is articulated through a narrative mode, and narrative attains its full meaning when it becomes a condition of temporal existence. He also reminds us that history in narrative form ultimately influences our identity. Our identity as individuals, our identity in the collectives or the groups that we are a part of or not a part of, those that are like us and those that are different, as well as public history, both whether it be city, state, national, or world. And he argues this through what he calls the narrative identity and the dialectic of selfhood and sameness. And this comes from his one self as another. But what's important here is that if history or historical narratives ultimately influence our identity or how we perceive our identity or how nations or groups of peoples define their identities, then we can recognize that we're in some very interesting, delicate terrain. So using Paul Ricoeur's philosophy, I argue then that in teaching students to decipher narratives, we want them to understand the pre-narratives, or the ideas that influence the historical narrative. What are the antecedents, the pre-ideas? There's a plot. There's a narrator. Who's telling the story? What about the scope and focus? Does this cover an entire nation from a certain period of time? Is this a very focused history on a particular group of people, such as women in the 19th century during the Civil War? What about the historical agents themselves, which could be the characters, those who are acting? What about their actions and their motives? What did the historical agents know, not know, and could not know? And this idea connects to the concept of historical empathy, that we want to teach students to understand history from the perspective of those who lived it, and that means appreciating what the historical agents knew and did not know. We often look at history from our own perspectives of our current time and judge people in the past based upon what we understand now. And that they had a different understanding then, and they did not know the outcome. Also, what about language, the influences of symbols, metaphors, and imagery? What ultimately does the historical narrative stand for? What about the creation of narrative as event. So the historical narrative itself was the writing of that narrative is an event. And even primary documents themselves have narrative components in them. And a primary document is an event making process. For instance, Sam Houston, when he wrote his autobiography of his experiences in the Texas Revolution and in his life, that was an event in and of itself. What's his intention? Who's his audience? What is he wanting to communicate? And finally, what are the post-narrative influences? How is the narrative continuing to influence people from beyond? Now, to use my previous example about the Alamo and the commercialization and the cultural glorification, if you want to say, of the Alamo and the way it's been represented in film, any of these same concepts here could be used for a narrative that may be questionably unhistorical, but in the same time communicating something about the historical past. Given the potency of narrative and historical narratives, we can see then why it would be easy for us to misperceive history or to go astray. This is one of the reasons why there are individuals who've been very critical of the use of historical narratives in the teaching of history. They're concerned about overly inflated or romanticized versions of history. My argument is that students bring who they are to the classroom, and that history, given its narrative nature, is going to influence the way in which students perceive. History is a part of us. And so instead of working against narrative, I argue that we work with it, and we work with what students bring, and we teach them then to be wise judges of the historical past. We want them to be able to critically compare historical narratives that are overly inflated, romanticized, memorialized, that are inaccurate, with those that we think are the most accurate based upon primary sources and documentary evidence. So what I'm going to encourage us to do is to be very cautious in using fictional structures to match historical narrative structures. Now, there are obviously similarities between fictional narratives and historical narratives. We still have people acting, we still have a plot, we still have outcomes. But I have learned in my own work with students and researching the way students perceive, I've learned that unconsciously they tend to apply fictional narratives that are encountered in film or in stories to historical narratives. And this is often done by creating hero and villain kinds of tales, epic journeys, patterns that are often common in movies. I find students often impose those patterns on history. We want to teach students to be wise judges of the historical past. We want them to be thinkers and interpreters of all narratives they encounter about history. In our next lecture, we'll talk specifically about how to do this, about how to teach students to interpret narratives, both in primary and secondary sources, as well as talk about the writing of historical narratives.